But for right now, we've got David, pronouns he, him, calling in from watery anglerfish. Aren't they all? As wants to talk about classic Chinese philosophy, which I don't know about you, but I'm not versed in. But more interestingly is calling in as a panzoist, which, as I understand, is the belief that the entire universe is indeed conscious. We've talked about this a few times. David, you were on the line with Forrest and Erika. How are you doing?
Hey, I'm doing great. It's nice to talk to you both. I've admired you for a long time.
Well, thank you. I can't wait to disappoint you.
So where do you want to start? You want to start with the pragmatic panzoist thing, or you want to start with the Chinese philosophy deal?
I'm going to be straight up with you. I don't have any training at all in Chinese philosophy. I don't have any good training in Western philosophy. I know a few philosophers I like, but I'm not prepared for any kind of a philosophy conversation. It would be pointless. So, like, much rather just stick to panzoism myself. But if you have something specific you want to bring up and we can talk about it without having to have a deep knowledge of individual philosophers and what they said, I'd be into it. Just as long as we don't get into a Jackie call of like, here's a million philosophers.
No, not doing that. I mean, I do feel like if I'm going to talk about Chinese philosophy not being Chinese and not speaking Chinese, I do have to say that it's from Roger Ames, who is the head of the humanitarian department at Peking University. Very well respected Chinese philosopher. Cool. So that's all.
I appreciate the clarification.
I think that it's important. That part of it is important, so I'll talk about that for a minute. So my view is that culture is built on top of past culture, that there's a foundation that starts, and then we kind of build up on that. We don't necessarily erase the bottom. So, for instance, Western culture is built on Christianity and the Platonic forms, this kind of transcendent belief in something that's permanent. And I believe that has now morphed into us believing in truth as being a transcendent thing. And so we look for laws of nature, we look for laws of logic, we look for all these things that don't change. They stay the same. And that's been a bias through Western culture right up till now. And I think we're at a point in science where that bias is hindering us. And the Chinese view from the way back, the I Ching is one of the oldest books in history, is the book of changes. And that their basic view of the world is everything is always transforming. Nothing is permanent. Everything is in the state of change. And that changes the whole way you look at the world. When you think of the world as having permanence, something that's real, more real than our experience, or which is all changing, when you think of that, you're always looking for truth. When you're recognizing that the world is always transforming, you're looking for balance. You're trying to figure out how to move in the world in a way that will make your life as good as it possibly can be, and recognize that truth is something else. Truth is based on trust. The Chinese word for truth, I can't pronounce it, at its radical is sincerity, but Roger Ames describes it as trust. So I believe in the theory of evolution, biology, because I trust that method. It's not because I think that it's permanently true.
Date. When was this person alive? Heraclitus. 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 I like it because it's got clit in it. It was around 540 BCE. Greek philosopher who said the only constant is change, and that you can't step in the same river twice, and that life is always changing. So, like, don't even need to go to a Chinese philosopher. We can go to a Greek one. And this seems to be like an old idea that the point I'm making is that this is an old idea that isn't unique to Eastern philosophy. I didn't know if you were bringing up Eastern philosophy to say that it is somehow truer, or like has more something to hang on to, or if you're just saying here's this old ass idea. What do you draw? Because there's what are you getting to? Like, what's the point?
Okay, the point is that this is the pragmatic point, that whatever we believe in, whatever has to be filtered through our value system. And that makes it that you constantly have to think about, what is my value system and what are the possible outcomes of this beliefs that I have in terms of how they affect the world around us. And you can see this in Chinese culture, and that's why it's much more important than the Western philosophers that have said this and been ignored and paved over by all these people that believe in transcendence. You can see that that made Chinese and much of Eastern culture much more socially oriented, much more concerned about their connections in relationships, their connections to the natural world, whereas the Western world, because of this preference for truth, has ignored so much of those kinds of things. It's led to individuality. It's led to this dismissal of the wild world. So that's my only point is that we have to think about what we're basing our beliefs on, run it through our value system, and then think about what that means in terms of how we act in the world.
I strongly disagree with the concept that because we are focused on truth, we necessarily get to individualism and a strong difference between culture and nature. Those are cultural constructs that are very different than science. And I would argue that is like science actually goes against those concepts, in my opinion. I from my search for truth and from my insistence on the scientific method and from my understanding of the scientific realities of this universe, actually derive a lot of meaning that are antithetical to the individualistic structure of Western society and to the dualistic separation of culture and nature. It sounds to me like you are taking this very like basic philosophy that is not in any way unique to this region and then blaming the rest of the culture of this region on that, and in so doing boiling down this culture and making it into almost a stereotype that you can then kind of like juxtapose against a stereotype of Western culture, and none of that's appropriate. I don't think any of that's reasonable or really justifiable in any way.
Okay, I hear that. Obviously, I have a lot more that I could say about Chinese culture. We have limited time, and I don't think it's appropriate. So, I mean, I have a lot more to say that would substantiate my case. I think
Maybe
that it's very worth. Huh?
I would take it up with a cultural anthropologist who specializes in those areas.
Yeah, I think that, my issue here is that it's like, I agree with a lot of what you've said, but I don't necessarily agree with the conclusions that you've drawn. So like, is the universe constantly in flux? Yeah. Does science facilitate that? Also, yeah. I think that that's like pretty evident from anybody who kind of dabbles in science of any type, right? I mean, change is what drives it all. So, I agree with that, but like outside of that, I don't really know that I can add anything to this conversation. I was trying to rack my brain, like what can I say? What can I actually say and add to this and bring something new to the table? But I don't really think I have anything. I just don't have any level of expertise in what you're talking about. And, again, like there's some of it that I'm like, yeah, I could get on board with that. And there's some of that I'm like, I don't really know that you could necessarily say it. And ultimately that makes me a boring addition to this conversation. So
it's just, there's not a lot to engage with there. Let's move on to the panzoism and see if we can get something out of that, and then we'll move on.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry. I don't mean to waste your time here.
No, it's really not that. I don't think you're wasting our time. I don't feel like my time is being wasted. I feel like you've called in for something profound from Forrest and I on this topic, but like I can't offer anything. This isn't where I'm coming from. So I don't want to, don't
Yeah.
get it twisted,
No, and I don't think
Okay.
it's a waste of time
I
to
mean,
discuss these things. I just think it's like the main point I'm making is that what you're saying here so far, maybe you have more, but like just based on what you've given me thus far, it's just caricatures, and it's not actually anything like that.
no,
That's
I
substantial.
disagree with you there. It's not caricatures. It's the basis of our culture. So if you think about, I mean, my
You
original
also said a
statement
minute
was
ago.
culture is.
You also said a minute ago that
Go ahead.
Christianity was the basis of like American culture, and that's not true either. And so, like, it's just
I didn't
it
say
is
American
caricatures.
culture. I mean, I didn't mean to say that.
Did you say
Western
Western? You
culture,
might
I
have said
do
Western.
believe.
I
That's
strongly
what I
disagree
meant
with
to
that as
say.
well. I still disagree with you.
Okay, what
And
is
so,
the
like,
basis of Western culture?
I don't think that you can pin down. I'm not a cultural anthropologist, so I'm not going to try. But like I can say from my perspective, it doesn't seem like you can really pin down one specific thing. We certainly don't follow every part of a Christian tradition, and like the idea that the thoughts, the moral and structural societal thoughts put forward in Christianity would be a new thing that were unique to Christianity or can be solely attributed to Christianity is ridiculous. Um, Not to mention the fact that we do a lot of things that are wrote against Christianity. And also, especially as we're talking about modern Western culture, it is very much a melting pot, especially here in America, especially considering the fact that America was largely based on Iroquois culture, that we stole the idea of like Congress and Parliament and all these things and then integrated it into our culture. And then that became a wave that swept backwards recursively across Europe, especially starting with the French Revolution and then moving from there to where all these other places gained a lot more independence because of America's adaptation and adoption of indigenous cultures here as we committed genocide against them and assimilated a little bit of their ideas. There's a lot to be said there. And to boil it down to say that Christianity is the basis of this culture, I think is grossly oversimplifying and leaving a lot of things out.
What?
And then to try to juxtapose that to Eastern culture as if that's a thing, and say that, oh, well, here's this one Chinese philosopher and this one Chinese idea, and therefore that's somehow unique and special and different. Even though that same concept is found across the philosophical landscape, as far as I can tell, and certainly across the cultural landscape in the indigenous cultures all around the world, having very individualistic and community-oriented societies that are not capitalistic and don't hold up and they're certainly not basing it off of whatever the fuck you brought up here. Just I think all you've given me is just kind of this here's this thing and here's a caricature of this culture and they seem to go hand in hand, and that's different than what we have over here, and that doesn't mean anything. And so like I said, man, I don't have a lot more to add because this isn't my area.
If it doesn't mean anything to you, then there's no reason for us to have the conversation. What I'm trying to get across. Pardon?
That's what I said a minute ago. Go on.
Okay. Well, I'm not making a caricature of these cultures, despite what you have to say. What I'm saying is that certainly you have to admit that 2,000 years of Christianity has had a major effect on how we think in our culture. Thought is built up. Culture is built up. It's not something that just happens to us all of a sudden. It's something that comes from our past. So and I'm just saying, because the basic bias of Western culture is in looking for things that are permanent, that exist outside of the changing world, that those things are still influencing the way we think.
I don't know what you're talking about with that, because that
Okay.
maybe I'm out of tune with Western culture, but I don't have anything like that. Sounds like idealism to me, and we're a very much materialistic culture. I don't get it. It maybe if you're talking about like the really cushy, flowery kind of like America with like this idealistic version of like eternal patriotism and justice and liberty and blah blah blah, certainly doesn't resonate with somebody like me who's philosophically opposed to those concepts. Certainly doesn't resonate with somebody like me or Erica who don't dabble in that type of thing. Overall,
Okay.
It's
Well,
it's
what I
just
was saying,
it's
what I
gross.
said
It
to
sounds
you,
grossly
Forrest,
oversimplified at best.
I hear that. This is a short conversation we're having. Um,
Sure.
um, what I said to you is that we've looked in the Western culture for things that are permanent, and we've come to things that are laws of nature, laws of physics, laws of logic, these kinds of things that we say, these things don't change, everything else changes. So that's because of this bias that we have had built into our culture. If it doesn't mean anything to you, that's fine. I'm sorry to use your time.
Does it mean to say that we have a bias, therefore we look to these things? Would you imply then that people who don't have that bias, people from these Eastern cultures you're describing, would not care for those things? Or would not
I
benefit
think
from
we
them?
all have bias. In fact, I think thought is based on bias. But
That's not what I asked you.
okay, excuse me. I think that because of the bias of the basis of Chinese philosophy, that everything is always in the state of transformation, this has changed the way they see the world. And there has
It's not
been
just Chinese
a
philosophy.
very
And also, I guarantee you, Chinese
right,
people
except for
are
we
cool
don't
with
pay any
concepts of
attention
like
to
laws of physics.
right. They are now. We don't pay any attention to Lucretius. We don't pay any attention to Epicurus. We don't pay any attention to those people. They did not have a significant influence on Western culture. Plato
I don't
had a
think you're
huge
good at
influence
philosophy
on
either.
Western culture.
You're
Pardon
calling
me?
into two people who I don't think that you're into philosophy either. You're calling into two people. We started this conversation saying we're not big on philosophy, and you're going to throw out Lucretius and Epicurus, who are like, those are names I even recognize because they're so incredibly influential and important, especially for science. And you're going to say that, like, yeah, they just didn't make a big impact. There's not that big of people. You might want to move on
So
to the
you
next
think
thing
that,
because this is going downhill quickly. If you want to have something to say about
okay.
panzoism and we can discuss that, it might be a good idea to move on.
Do you think we could maybe like dig in a little bit to this idea? And if I'm mischaracterizing you here, like let me know that there's like some kind of conscious nature or awareness to like the universe and all living things. Am I wrong? Am I off base on like that's a tenet or at least like a general idea that tends to be associated with panzoism?
Panzoism is not, what I believe is that everything is part of life. I don't believe consciousness is that. I'm not an idealist. I don't believe that.
Okay, well, I'm useless here
there's
too.
Probably nothing to dig in there. So
everything
sorry,
is part of life. Are you talking about a universal scale, or are you meaning to say that, like, astrologically speaking, there's like every part of physics is also involved in life? Because I can vibe with that, but are you talking like literally shit going on in the horseshoe or in the Horsehead Nebula and in the Sombrero Galaxy are necessary and functionally a part of life here on Earth? Is that what you're saying?
Basically, yeah, I am saying that everything is connected to everything else, and that all works together in a way that has made what we call life. Okay. Well, I mean, so my argument there is and I've heard you say, Forrest, that we can't define life. We have some criteria, but so at what point does the oxygen that we get our energy from, when does that become alive? Is it dead and then we breathe it in and then it's part of our life, or is
oxygen becomes part of life when it's involved? Oxygen becomes part of life when it is integrated into organic molecules which are functioning within a living being. Your DNA contains oxygen. That oxygen is a part of a living thing. The oxygen itself is not alive, but that you don't even have to go on oxygen for that. That's the fundamental of cell theory. Cells are the smallest things we can call alive. Individual organelles, even things like mitochondria, which reproduce by themselves, are not alive. So cells are alive. The molecules, the macromolecules and molecules and atoms and quarks and leptons that make those things are not alive. And those parts are going to change all the time.
Right. And this is reductionism. And I believe that reductionism is losing some of its value in terms of how we do science. That this notion that everything can be broken into its little parts and have its, that's
David,
not true as an evolutionary biologist, right? When does a species become a species? Never.
Oftentimes things can be broken into their little parts, right? Biology is notorious for being a gradient. It's notorious for being messy in that it's difficult to create neat little boxes that things fall into. But at the same time, while it's difficult to tell when red becomes yellow, you can certainly say that some colors are red and some colors are yellow. In the same way that we can say that while it's difficult to point out when life emerges or when a species becomes a new species, right? Or descent modification, when a population, you get peripatric or whatever types of speciation, you can certainly say that a rock is not alive, whereas an organism is. You see what I mean? Like it's quite easy to tell the difference there.
Unless you want to get back into philosophy and talk about dualisms between life and non-life and talk about the cultural anthropology and different ontologies from indigenous cultures that didn't distinguish things that way. And maybe they're right. And I say that as a joke, but I can't tell if that's actually where you're going.
Or please don't take us back there. It's so dark and scary in that part of the conversation. I have nothing to add.
Okay.
Let me have.
Well, you have other callers. Why don't you just move on? Thanks for talking with me.
You didn't say anything yet. Like you said that when does
oxygen
oxygen become alive?
I did say things, and I resent you saying that.
Yeah, no, we moved on to talking about the universe being a part of life. I'm talking about this part of the conversation. We moved on to this where we said everything in the universe is alive, and you said, when does oxygen become alive? We both gave you a thorough answer, and you're like, all right, let's move on. What are you talking about?
Well, I'm happy to keep the conversation going. It's just that you guys don't seem to want to. What I'm talking about is...
David, if I may, because I resent that
Sure.
a little bit, because it is never my intent to make someone feel like I'm not interested in what they have to say. I will be honest when I have nothing to add, and when something is outside of my realm of expertise, which I was earlier, and then we took it into this area of like, okay, when does something become alive? That's an interesting conversation. When does something become a new species?
Okay.
But why is biology so messy? I find that fascinating. I can add something to that, but I was sort of in jest saying that if we take it back to the place it was previously, I cease to have something to add. So that's all we were doing there. And then I feel like you kind of took that as it was meant to be like, oh, like I don't value what your input is or what you have to say. What makes you take the stance that everything is a part of life when we can in fact say when something is alive versus when it is not?
Okay, what makes me think that is because I think that, say, a rock, an example of a rock. So we can't live without rocks. We have to have minerals as part of our system. So we're so interdependent. Things are so intertwined that it's, for me, it's impossible to say where those lines are. And I think that in some ways, always trying to pay attention to what those lines are, where those separations are, has had a tendency to hold back where we need to go in investigating the world we live in, because we're so attached to this reductionist view that it makes us not see the movement between. So we think of the world as a whole bunch of objects, right? But actually, it's also a whole bunch of movement.
You're just defining
but
ecology.
Yeah, but and if I may, right? Like there are aspects of rocks that we require, but there are also aspects of the geologic world of certain ecologies of various ecosystems that are not required for every ecosystem, right? Case in point, we've seen large-scale ecosystem turnover since the dawn of life on this planet. Some organisms or niches have persisted, some come and go. So I would make the argument that, again, while I agree that the boundary between what is alive and what is not can be difficult within biology, with viruses or organelles or whatever, as we sort of alluded to earlier, like some things have some of the characteristics of life and not all. So where do they fall? You can certainly point at something that has none of the characteristics of life and say that that thing is not alive, or you can point at elements or whatever that are extremely rare in the universe and have no role in ecosystems on planet Earth and say that is not a part of life, right? So I find it difficult to get on board with the premise that you just stated. It's like, well, everything in the universe has to do with life in some way. You see what I mean? Because some stuff just is, and it doesn't impact us in any way. Some stuff is drastically, vitally important to everything that we do and are, and has always been, and some stuff isn't. And while I can appreciate, certainly I can appreciate seeing the beauty in the interconnected nature of all of the things biotic and abiotic on the planet, I don't necessarily agree with the idea that we can derive a spirituality or a spiritual importance from that. You can, but I don't know that you have to.
Yeah, that's kind of exactly where I'm at. Like, all you're describing here, David, is ecology. The idea that, like, all the living and non-living parts of an ecosystem all work together in tandem, and they're all rely on each other. And you can expand that to the entire biosphere, to the whole Earth, and even you can expand it to the solar system. You can do the sun is very much involved in our system. So, like, you can take this on a somewhat cosmic scale, and that makes total sense. But then to say in some distant galaxy billions of light years from here, there's that shit's important for life on Earth, that doesn't make any sense. There's these boundaries and definitions that we're setting are useful. They're not necessarily constraining, but they're necessary for us to know what we're talking about. Otherwise, we would have to account for the entire universe to understand any bit of life, when that isn't necessary at all.
I agree with you that the boundaries are useful. I'm not trying to make that case. That I love science, and I think that there's much value there. I'm just trying to say that we need to think more about the movement between objects, the movement of objects, and less about objects, because we're running against a wall now that can be facilitated. We can work our way through it if we start trying to open up our way of looking at the world.
So can I ask a question, David?
Sure.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No.
To sort of ask a question to that point, right? Like, you're coming at this from this perspective that it's like Chinese philosophy, has this kind of figured out, and they all look at it in this different way. And setting aside generalizations or whatever, let's take that at face value. Do you think that China, right, like where it's at scientifically speaking, with their scientific progress, with their scientific community, like, do you think that they're categorically figuring out things that we aren't here in the West, or that the global South isn't, or like different locations aren't figuring out? Like, do you think that philosophy has tangibly impacted their output, scientifically speaking?
I really wouldn't want to. I just wouldn't venture any argument there. I don't know enough about the current state of Chinese science. I do think that Chinese culture for many years has benefited by having this way of thinking, and that's why they shoot each other a whole lot less. That's why they are much less predatory in the world.
I thought maybe them shooting each other a lot less had something to do with their gun laws, but here I am.
I mean, I would hazard to say the same thing.
No, it's a long history. There's a long history there of people not being violent towards each other.
Let's set that aside for a minute, because I have thoughts on that.
Okay.
I'm sure Forrest does too.
That's not reasonable.
I have thoughts on that. But what I would also say is that it's like there is, and I'm like, I've got like science brain rot, right? Like, whenever I get into the philosophy conversations, my mind is immediately like, oh, okay, well, how can we test that? How can we investigate that? Within the realm of like the stuff that I actually have a decent grasp on. I think that's human. I think we like to pull things into comprehensible places. But sure. I think that your case could very easily be made, or defeated by looking at the status of the scientific community in China and seeing, like, are they making these strides that other regions aren't? Because if they have this ideology that is so ingrained and threaded into their culture to the extent that it's like they're, as you sort of alluded to moments ago, they're like literally killing each other less, which again, I don't agree with that, but that's beside the point. Shouldn't we see that, like, across the board with their scientific advancements? Like, shouldn't they be making all of these discoveries because they're taking movement into account and the nature interconnectedness of everything into account? I would argue, at least in the fields that I'm familiar with, and maybe Forrest has got a different opinion on this, I'm not seeing a categorical difference in which regions are collectivist or individualistic or have this sort of Eastern philosophy or don't, in what they're putting out scientifically. I don't see it. Maybe it's because, again, I've got the science brain rot and I'm not seeing the philosophy involved, but like I don't see it. And so that makes me doubt this idea that it's like, oh, if we had this massive paradigm shift in our philosophy in the West, that would make all of this, that would push us forward, in some way.
Yeah,
You
I
get what I'm
agree.
saying?
Like, there's no, I guess, yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. Like, it is true to say that people from different cultural backgrounds with different heuristics or different ontologies are going to come to different scientific discoveries sometimes, but they're still using science to do it. They just have a different worldview and a different viewpoint that gets them to the science in the first place. And sometimes they see new things, but they're using the same scientific method and they're coming to the same kinds of scientific truth because that is what objective reality is all about. So, like, to say that they're going to have some secret key to science doesn't make any sense. And certainly to say that they are less, like, a different history of violence and aren't going to be as violent and everything as Western culture, that's nonsense. Like, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
Okay, well, I would look into that if I were you.
I'll start with the genocide against the Uyghurs and move my way from there.
Okay, and I know a lot about Western imperialism and the effects that has had. But
I think
yes.
The point, though, David, is that it's like this is pot calling the kettle black, right? Like, it's unfortunately, as humans, we are these incredibly compassionate, incredibly monstrous animals where, like, we're simultaneously capable of great kindness and genocide. And, like, that's why you can find genocide everywhere, right? Like, there's no human culture that is immune to being xenophobic, right? Like, that's just the nature of us as a creature. And I would argue that it's like, some philosophies might tamp that down or amp it up, but that's, again, not the question that I'm asking. The question, and maybe, Forrest is asking something different, I don't know, but like where I'm coming from here is that it's like, okay, if Eastern philosophy is to move science forward, why aren't we seeing that pan out? If this has been where they stand for so long and that this is so imperative to scientific understanding, why isn't that showing in their scientific output? I'm not saying it's making them worse. I'm just saying that we're kind of all in the same place because, as Forrest alluded to, the purpose of science is to be objective and to sort of kind of transcend cultural norms because you're using the scientific method, which is universal and has been independently discovered by every human group on the face of the earth since the dawn of our species, since the dawn of our genus, since the dawn of our order, really, to some extent. So it's like, I don't know that implementing Eastern philosophy here is going to make that great of a difference at a sort of national scale, just because it doesn't seem to be doing that where it's naturally found.
I think that's a very worthwhile question, and it would be interesting to investigate it. I have not, so I don't know. There is obviously a very deep sort of cooperative nature to the way the Chinese do science, which is true of us too. I mean, science is a cooperative endeavor for sure. It has to be. But that's a question I can't address. Don't know, but someone could. I mean, it is something that would be testable to see what the differences are in the.
Japan also has a very cooperative culture with a rich history of, like, reliant on your neighbor and having, like, this individualistic society and similar. I don't know any philosophers in particular, but, like, I'm 99% sure they have pretty similar philosophies in these ways. Would you agree with that?
They took a different kind of turn with Confucianism, but and that's a whole different question, and you guys don't want to talk about that, and that's fine. But yeah, Japan took that turn, and I would suggest that, especially if you're Japanese, you're much safer on the streets. You're much less likely to be a victim of crime in Japan than you would be here.
And Japan also has a long history of racism and imperialism, and there was like
absolutely totally agree there. Yep.
Yeah, so like to sit here and say that like they didn't kill hundreds of thousands of people in Nanjing, but because they have this beautiful culture of non-individualism and all this stuff, like you are continuing after this whole time to conflate like one philosophical principle that's kind of traditional in a culture with the actual whole breadth of the culture. That's what I was talking about earlier about
you're
caricatures.
Strawmanning me. You're strawmanning me there, Forrest. I'm sorry.
I'm not at all.
Okay, well, that's your belief. That's fine. I did not say anything about the Japanese not having a violent history. Obviously, I've paid some attention to the history of the world and have some idea about that.
I didn't say you did. What I'm saying is that you are taking
I heard you say that.
one small part of this one philosophical tradition from this one region and saying that it's indicative of like their entire cultural background and the way they do science and the way they view the world and the progress that can be made in this region and all these other things, and not taking into account the fact that their cultural traditions are as diverse and rich as ours are. So for you to sit here a minute ago at the beginning of the call, you were saying that like, well, Lucretius and Epictetus and whoever else, these people aren't as big of a deal. You're identifying and recognizing the fact that we have very broad cultural ideas here in the West, that all these different philosophers, they're all disagreeing with each other, and they have different parts of different societies and all this big broad. And then in this Eastern culture, you're like, no, they're all, this is this one thing one philosopher said, and they're all like that. And then that's why they're going to do these things differently. That's what I'm talking about with caricatures and stuff. It's you are grossly oversimplifying two chunks of the world as if they are monoliths based on some singular cultural or philosophical idea, and then saying that that is now this pathway to like scientific or objective reality. And I don't get where you're drawing that line, and I don't get how you're not painting, how you are comfortable painting them with this massively broad brush and ignoring the fact that they have been just as violent and fucked up as anybody else in the world because they are people in that culture. And you're going to say that they're less violent and they don't hurt each other and that's actually all safe, and not attribute that to like their laws or their culture or a religious difference or anything else. It's all just worldview from this one philosophy thing, and ignoring the current genocide that they are committing. Like that's, I don't get how you're comfortable doing any of this. It is the same thing for this whole call. It is just a gross oversimplification of major big philosophical ideas, a caricature of a culture, and then saying that we need to learn from this thing, which doesn't exist. It's this ethereal thing you've made up.
I did not make that up. And you're mischaracterizing me. I'm saying that culture does have strains that become dominant in those strains.
No
and
one's
maybe
arguing
you don't
with
believe that, and that's fine. So I'm just talking about the dominant strains. I'm not saying that we or the Chinese are somehow, that's all we have in our culture is that one strain. I'm just saying that has a basis for the way we think about the world. And then it is different, and you are safer in China, and it's not just because of their laws. It's always been that way.
You're very much safer in China unless you're a Uyghur and unless you speak out against the government. Then that, and unless you do something,
I am not arguing.
Then that's bad.
Okay. Okay, I'm not trying to argue that the Chinese are some kind of magically better people. I'm just trying to say that we do have a different basis of how we understand the world from thousands of years back, and that we build on top of that basis. This is the part of the thing that I'm not sure you heard me in, is that I've said that culture has a base for it, and then you build up on top of that.
Argued with it.
So I'm just trying. It's not a caricature. I'm just trying to explain what that base is. Doesn't that make any sense?
I understand what you're saying. It's not accurate, and it's a very, very oversimplified view of this culture and their history, and that's an issue. And it's not, what you're saying is not accurate, and it's just not reasonable or justifiable. No one's arguing that cultures have bases. No one's arguing that cultures evolve and grow. No one's arguing that cultures build on each other. But the fact that we live in a global society is like super fucking influential here. And like every other conclusion you've drawn from this thing has been either like really, really reductive or a caricature, and it's not cool. It's been 40 minutes, dude. I think we need to move on to another one. We got 2 calls left, and we got 20 minutes left before we end the show.
Okay. Well, thanks for talking with me. I'll still admire you both. I'll talk to you later, maybe. Bye.
Take care.
Thanks,
bye-bye.
David.
Maybe talk to a cultural anthropologist or a historian about this, because like, no.
Yeah.
Just no.
I feel like that was just, ultimately there was a strain of that, which was basically just like, he's saying we have an individualistic culture and they have a collectivistic culture. Like, yes, I agree. But like, I don't,
sure.
What I really wanted to dig into is like, okay, where does that intersect with science? Like what we do and why we do it. And I just feel like that's something that we can actually look at, and we don't seem to see that. And in fact, I have this anecdote where it's like, I work with Miocene apes, and it's like there's this well-known sort of situation with the Miocene where it's like, the guys that work on the Gigantopithecus maxilla and the guys that work on the Gigantopithecus mandible don't like each other very much, and they won't collaborate with each other. And like, that's hindering our understanding of that critter. So it's like, then they're both Chinese paleoanthropologists or paleoprimatologists. So it's like, I don't know, like that's an interesting conversation to me, but it's like you said, with the other stuff for me, and I kind of felt like David was painting it almost like, oh, like we're brushing him off, but it's like, no, I just don't know this subject very well. And it's one thing if we're arguing about something, but I genuinely don't even have anything to add. Like I don't have a strong opinion. So
yeah, it's weird. I'm just going to go ahead and leave just for funsies. Here's a link in the chat from Wikipedia, a list of massacres in China going back through Imperial China into the Republic of China, into the People's Republic of China. There's a lot there, and like and you know what it looks like when you look at it? It looks exactly like the kind of massacres from Western cultures for the exact same reason.
And the global South, and indigenous people in America, and like every human group that has ever lived, because it's a shocker, but we are far more alike than we are not alike. Humans are awesome in a lot of ways, and we're shitty in a lot of ways, and that echoes through time and space. And I agree, like certain philosophies can like tamp down on that sometimes. I don't know that we can necessarily point to one and say this is the one that does the best job across the board. And that goes for Eastern philosophy as much as it goes for any. So at least insofar as I know.
I agree.
Hey there, Eric. Noting that anyone watching that clip makes atrociously poor life decisions, where should they send their protection money to prevent further damage?
All protection money should be sent to patreon.com/calltheline, or else we will break your kneecaps.
Okay, we can't say that. I think we can't say that.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Hit like and subscribe.